Okay. Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started here soon. I think the sessions in our flanking rooms have already have started to move, so we'll get rolling as well. We were given it a couple extra minutes just to let the people, a few extra people roll in. There was a social event last night that I heard went a little late, so which is a good thing. We've got coffee to help with that. No Advil. You'll have to get that from a friend, but thanks for coming here today. I'm Keith Drover. I'll chair this session. Before we get into that, I want to thank all of you for coming out and spending the morning with us, both remotely. This is going to stream, and in person, of course. This is a very important discussion to us, so we really appreciate your time. There are people here who traveled from quite a distance as well, so we greatly appreciate the efforts in getting here. It adds a lot of depth to the discussion, so we truly appreciate that. So as you can see from the screen, this is the industry panel. We're going to be discussing some of the initiatives and challenges we see in the heavy industry sector, and look for areas of improvement and some insights from you in how we can improve things. The industry panel, we're going to look at three main focus areas. We're going to talk about reductions policies, so things like carbon pricing. That'll be one of the focus areas. We're going to talk about energy efficiencies and areas for improvement in the sector. And finally, we're going to talk about the development and the deployment of clean technologies. Things we see in other regions, things we do see here that are working, and maybe things we can bring that are going to help reduce the emissions in the province. So that's the focus areas. So the way this is going to work, each panelist will get about 10 minutes. I'm sure most of you were here yesterday, so same format. We'll have 10 minutes for each panelist. Then we're going to have about 10-15 minutes for questions and answers following that. We're going to do that as a group setting. And then following that, we're going to have a Citizens Assembly breakout session. That's a brainstorming session. I won't get too much into that right now. We'll dig more into that after we get through the first half of the event. So that's probably enough from me. I'm going to pass the conch over to Gerald here in a second. I'm just going to quickly introduce our expert panel. Really appreciate these fine people for coming out and spending the morning with us and preparing some information to share with the group. We have Gerald Crane here with the Government of Newfoundland and Labrador, the Climate Change Division. Gerald's going to talk to us about kind of an overview of the whole thing and energy pricing. We have, I'm going to do it in order of the presentation. So Kieran Hanley with NIA, our Environmental Industry Association. Kieran's going to focus mostly on the oil and gas sector. Speaking after that, we're going to have Erin Cullen with Valet. Erin's going to speak to some of the initiatives in the mining sector. And then we have Melissa English-Barbour. She's with Aqua Solutions, and they're an engineering firm. They specialize in offshore, both offshore wind and offshore oil and gas. And Melissa's going to discuss some of the initiatives they've taken locally. So with all that said, I'm going to stop speaking and ask Gerald to come up. And one second, Gerald. It's early.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to speak here this morning. My role here this morning is really to provide a broad-scale overview of carbon pricing in the province, with a particular focus on large industry and some of the outcomes that we expect from that system over time. I'll start off with a quick introduction. I'll give you a quick overview of how carbon pricing is being applied in the province, and then focus more on large industry and some of the expected outcomes. So where are we? So of course climate change is a critical problem, global problem. Within the country, the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change was agreed to by First Ministers, Prime Minister Trudeau, the various premiers, including Premier Vale. It's a national plan focused on both mitigation and adaptation. Carbon pricing is a key element of that plan. In that plan and prior to it, the federal government said to provinces, we will introduce carbon pricing into provinces and territories starting January the 1st, 2019, unless a province or territory introduces a comparable system. Doesn't mean equivalent, doesn't mean the same, it has to be comparable. They're subject to minimum federal requirements. Starting January 2019, we introduced the Made in Newfoundland and Labrador approach to carbon pricing. We opted to do our own system subject, or so that we can meet our various social, economic, and fiscal realities in the province. There are a number of principles that underpin that, and I'll speak to those in a moment. About half the provinces are doing their own system or elements of a system. So Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island in part, Quebec, Alberta, British Columbia, Northwest Territories are doing their own systems. The other provinces, the federal government is imposing a system on those provinces. What does our emissions look like, and how does it look like over time? This chart here looks at greenhouse gas emissions in the province since 1990. That's the black line across the bottom. You'll see there as well a red line, that's real gross domestic product in the province, again since 1990. And the green line is real personal income, so that's the income we mean you have in our pockets. And really what you see is that there's been a decoupling of greenhouse gas emissions with economic growth since about the year 2000 ballpark. So far we've been able to grow the economy a lot faster than we've been growing emissions. The challenge we have is how do we shrink those emissions? How do we reduce that black line? We've been able to stabilize it while the economy is growing. How do we now move forward and shrink that or cause that black line to decline over time? Carbon pricing is a key element of that. So I mentioned we're introducing a carbon pricing system starting January of this year. It's called a hybrid system. And what does that mean? It means there's two parts to it. So in its simplest form, every liter of fuel in the province that's combusted is subject to a carbon tax unless it's exempted. And there are some exemptions, and they're outlined to the carbon tax. Large industry is exempted from a carbon tax. And why is that? It's because they're subject to a different system called a performance standard system, and that's what I'll describe here today. The plan that we put forward is guided by four overarching principles: maintaining competitiveness from a tax and trade perspective. A lot of our large industry, oil and gas, Valet here, IOC, the refinery, and so on, they compete in international markets. And what we wanted to do was put forward a system that achieved greenhouse gas reductions while allowing those companies to continue to be profitable and continue to be able to produce. Minimize the impact on consumers and vulnerable groups. That's more of a carbon tax piece, and I won't speak to that a whole lot here today. Recognize the investment to decarbonize electricity. So what we were able to talk with the federal government was how do we achieve credit for the investment in Muskrat Falls while at the same time taking Holyrood offline 15 years prior to the end of its useful life. And of course, delivering reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, because that's why we're doing this to start with. So how does it cover our economy? This chart here looks at our emissions in 2017. On the right-hand side, the dark red and light red is large industry in the province. It accounts combined for about 36–37% of our emissions. Holyrood is most of the green on the bottom right. These are covered by performance standards, and that's the work that I do. What you see there, 47% in total, is covered by large industry. Some is exempted. 2 percentage points is exempted. So the practical coverage is 45 out of the 47% identified here. Transportation, buildings, and diesel electricity is covered by a carbon tax. There are some exemptions, such as diesel electricity. The federal government exempted it, and we, in turn, exempted it here as well. I know off-grid electricity was discussed yesterday. Stuff that's not covered is basically waste and agriculture. Those are non-energy emissions, and they're not subject to carbon pricing. So what I will talk about is basically what's happening on the right-hand side here. Large industry, who are they? The dark red, the onshore, that's IOC, the refinery, Valet's 2 facilities, Cornerbrook Pulp and Paper, Tata Steel, and St. Lawrence Canada Fluorospar. Offshore, it's the 4 production facilities plus the mobile offshore drilling units, and Holyrood, of course, from an electricity perspective. So what are we doing? In the interest of time, I'm going to focus here on the second bullet. In the first bullet basically says we have a piece of legislation that outlines what will happen or how it will be governed. In the offshore area, the CNL-OPB has a delegated authority to implement the Act. What we're doing is establishing facility-specific targets. And so what we're saying to Valet and others is you have to reduce your emissions by 6% relative to what you were doing prior to 2019. So in other words, if you emitted 100 tons of emissions in 2017, in its simplest form, you're only allowed to emit 94 in 2019. Though that reduction target will rise by 2 percentage points a year to about 12% by 2022. So again, in its simplest form, if you emit 100 tons prior to 2019, by 2022, you're only allowed to emit 88 tons by law. We recognize up front, and we heard from a variety of stakeholders, not only industry, that companies require time to prepare for this, to invest in order to achieve these reductions. So what we're doing is we established a credit market. This is the first credit market in the environmental sector in this province. It's common throughout the developed world, US, rest of Canada, but it's the first one in this province. And so what we're saying to companies is if you cannot physically reduce your emissions on site in the near term, you can buy, just for some of your target credits, greenhouse gas reduction credits. You can buy these credits from government. They're called fund credits. So that will go into an arm's length industry fund to reduce emissions. Again, by legislation, government cannot use that money for other public services. It has to be used for greenhouse gas reduction projects. Or you can buy what we call performance credits from other facilities. So Valet, as opposed to reducing by 6 tons or 6% in 2019, if they reduce by 12% in 2019, we say we're going to reward your good behavior. We will give you credit for that extra 6%. You can take that amount of credit and you can save it for a future year. You can put it in a piggy bank, or you can sell it to other companies and monetize it. So you can take it, Valet, I'm looking at Erin because she's speaking, Valet could sell it to IOC and they can monetize the value of that. So we don't want to penalize good behavior, we want to reward good behavior. There's also provision, and it's not on the slide, for offset credits, and we're looking at how to establish an offset credit market. It's not in place right now, but hopefully over the short to medium term, we'll have that in place. What are the benefits to industry? Essentially what we're saying to industry here is you have to reduce your emissions. What does that mean for them? They have to respond. The companies that are out there, they need to figure out how they're going to be in compliance with this. It will generate new investments and new opportunities, and Kieran and Erin will speak to that a little bit. It will save them money, and how will it save them money? If you replace an old furnace with a newer, more efficient furnace, your fuel use goes down, your operational costs goes down. Others are mentioned here. You are able to attract and retain employees, excuse me. You're able to attract investors, enhance your corporate reputation, and so on. The main thing for us is we really want these companies to be creative, to figure out how to do it. We're establishing a bubble around a facility. We're saying you have to reduce emissions within that bubble. You figure out how to do it. We'll give you a credit market, we'll give you a credit market if you can't do it in the near term, but figure out how to do it, be creative, reduce your emissions over time. Environmental outcomes, and this is the big one, of course. Federal government, as I mentioned, would have imposed a system on us had we not put in place our own system. We, by our modeling and federal modeling, we're able to achieve equivalent outcomes from an environmental perspective at 4 times lower the cost. And why is that? The federal government is putting in place a different type of system that looks at comparable facilities across the country. A lot of our facilities don't have comparable competitors. If you look at the offshore sector, there's no other offshore sector in other provinces, Nova Scotia excluded. There's only 2 pelletizers in the country. There's only 1 refinery that doesn't have access to natural gas, and so on and so forth. So we were able to design this system in a boutique way that allowed us to get equivalent outcomes at much lower cost. The cumulative direct on-site reductions, about 650,000 tons to 2030. So what does that mean? Put that in perspective. The Terra Nova FPSO emits in total about that amount per year. So essentially what we're saying in equivalent terms is it's the equivalent of taking one of those offshore facilities offline from here per year from here to 2030. Valet is speaking, so I put Valet up here. 650,000 tons is what Valet will emit in total per year over 5 years. Valet emits about 120, 130,000 tonnes in total. 650 is about 5 years' worth of total emissions from Valet. I hear a lot about the offshore sector and that they are not subject to this. The offshore production platforms are subject to a greenhouse gas reduction target. The cumulative amount that they will have to reduce by law this year is equal to what Valet emits in total this year. About 120,000, 130,000 tonnes per year is what the offshore sector has to reduce this year. The sale of performance credits from hydro for the Holy Regenerating Station. So I mentioned earlier we're getting credit for the early closure of the Holy Regenerating Station. We're awarding Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro performance credits for that foregone emissions. They are able to take those credits and sell to other companies in the economy. The revenues from that will be used to mitigate electricity rate mitigation. If you look at the province's plan that was released prior to budget 2019, you'll see that the 2021 number was somewhere around $8.7, $8.8 million was forecasted. So on that basis, I'm done with carbon pricing. I just want to mention another thing that we hear a lot is, what are you doing with the money? So this is more on the carbon tax side. So this year in budget 2019, there's a projection that we will receive about $66 million in carbon tax revenue from fuel at the pumps. What are we doing with the money? And so you'll see here there's a low carbon economy leadership fund. That's a fund that's with a variety of eligible applicants. We're putting almost $90 million into that over the next 3 years. Investing in Canada Infrastructure Fund. That's a huge fund, $600 million over the next decade. Of that, about $300 million is targeted at green infrastructure. Some of the examples are listed here, and $100 million at public transit. We're also putting money into EV infrastructure, with partnering with Newfoundland Hydro on that. Newfoundland Hydro and Newfoundland Power are delivering a range of energy efficiency programs. Newfoundland and Labrador Housing Corporation as well is delivering a program. We put extra money into that this year. And on the adaptation side, we are putting about $1.5 million over the next couple of years into that. Is it dollar for dollar? It's always hard to say that it's dollar for dollar, but substantively the provincial expenditures in this field, in this area, are increasing substantively at the same time that carbon revenues are increasing over the same period. With that, I'm done, and turn it back to Mr. Drover here. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerald. Encourage everybody to check out the Turn Back the Tide website if you haven't been. There's lots of great information on the site. Also, if there's any questions that you have during the session that we don't get to at some point in time, just want to throw it out there. We do encourage people to head to Twitter, and we do have a hashtag for this session. It's hashtag DNL Industry. So if there's any questions we don't get to, feel free to fire them at us through that forum. All right, I'm going to ask Kieran Hanley to come on up, and Kieran's going to speak to us a little bit about the offshore sector.
I'm going to cover, by the way, much more than the offshore. That's going to be one big piece of it. But good morning, everyone. Thanks, Keith. My name is Kieran Hanley. I'm the Executive Director of the Newfoundland and Labrador Environmental Industry Association, or NEA. We're an association of about 200 members working to support the development of clean technology and the growth of the green economy in the province. So I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference for giving us the opportunity to present. The businesses within our membership are the businesses working towards a cleaner future for not just Newfoundland and Labrador, but around the world where they export their products, services, and expertise. You may have seen in the back of the room this book. This is our Clean Technology and Environmental Services Directory. This gives us all a pretty good indication of the capabilities and assets that exist in our province relating to clean growth. Most, if not all, of the businesses that you have heard from at this conference, you'll find in this book. They work in all sectors of the economy, from renewable energy to aquaculture, to waste management, to mining, to wastewater management, to remediation, to oil and gas, and so on. NEA's role is to deliver business development support to these members and in doing so, focuses its activities and initiatives in 6 areas by providing a support framework for entrepreneurs and startups, networks to help increase productivity and competitiveness, tools to encourage and foster innovation, export and international business development programming, training and professional development opportunities tailored to environmental sector employees, and leadership on policy and advocacy issues. We work with our firms one-on-one in this regard, but I wanted to provide just a couple of examples of how these priorities manifest themselves into overarching initiatives. So here are 3 examples of that. First, for the past 5 years, we've run programming to export Newfoundland and Labrador's expertise in and around climate change adaptation, the oceans, and how both of these things relate to island and remote environments into target markets in the Caribbean. Places like Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, St. Lucia, and so on, which are great places for Newfoundland and Labrador businesses to engage because they're engaging in markets that are of similar size, similar scale, and believe it or not, cultures that are quite compatible. Second, this year, NEA was one of 13 organizations selected from across Canada to administer a Federation of Canadian Municipalities project. We are working with 6 cities and towns in Newfoundland and Labrador to first quantify their greenhouse gas emissions contributions, develop customized long-term plans aimed at reducing them, and actually make targeted capital investments towards those plans. Third, we've just begun a project that aims to increase the transfer of technology and ideas between Newfoundland and Labrador and Northern Europe. This will include helping businesses in this province leverage their expertise in offshore oil and gas and diversify into the offshore wind energy industry. It will also include helping local firms establish partnerships with businesses in leading jurisdictions like Norway and the UK to bring clean technologies to Newfoundland and Labrador that will help reduce greenhouse gas emissions within our own offshore oil and gas industry. This is but 3 of a wide variety of activities that we are engaged in. Our activities, just so you know, are often supported by the government of Newfoundland and Labrador, the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency, or ACOA, and a wide variety of federal government departments and agencies from time to time. If you're curious about what else we're up to or want to keep tabs on us, keep an eye on our newsletter, which I say is weekly. Matt, who is our marketing and communications coordinator, would beg to differ on that. He chides me quite regularly. He's like, "Where's the weekly newsletter, Kieran?" It's kind of bi-weekly. Considering all of our activities, essentially, NEA's primary objective is to stimulate new entrepreneurship, research and development, innovation, and adoption relating to clean growth. So, where do we want these activities to take place? Ideally, activity first addresses local challenges, is economically viable second, and third is exportable. Exportable because international business contributes exponentially to the diversification of our economy. An enormous amount of information has recently become available to inform what our priorities could or should be. This includes a host of provincial sector growth strategies, Canadian clean growth frameworks, provincial climate change plans, economic development initiatives, and much more. Thus, NEA is currently engaging its partners in the development of a long-term clean technology growth plan. This would include improving environmental outcomes from all sorts of perspectives, such as waste management, energy efficiency, wastewater, risk mitigation, and the list can go on. But as this conference is about decarbonization, and this panel is about heavy industry, let's take a look at things from that perspective. We've seen various iterations of this slide many times over the past couple of days. The 36% here on the right side, the combination of large industry onshore and offshore, represents emissions, of course, from large industry. And NEA has been working with a number of them, mining, oil and gas, forestry, and aquaculture, to explore opportunities for clean technology development and adoption. One example of efforts in this regard was a business development mission that NEA undertook in Norway in March to explore clean technology opportunities within offshore oil and gas. On the topic of greenhouse gas emissions specifically, we learned 2 really important things. First, the electrification of activities is the single most effective way to achieve substantial greenhouse gas emissions reductions. This would include powering offshore assets and activities through subsea cables with electricity generated from renewable sources, either onshore or in situ or out in the ocean. It is also the most expensive way to reduce emissions. Second, in lieu of electrification, finding energy or process efficiencies offshore to reduce the use of fossil fuels in their processes is an area ripe for innovation of new products and services to achieve step change reductions. As discussions over the past day or so have illustrated, we're seeing this notion of electrification emerging across the board as opportune for Newfoundland and Labrador in the pursuit of the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Cars, buses, homes, buildings, ferries, ports, industrial activities. A very random example from yesterday and from the fisheries panel, Kieran from Ocean Choice International spoke of transitioning their forklifts to become electric in their operations. Investing in the electrification of each of our major industries through revolutionary approaches like power from shore and by uncovering these less obvious opportunities like replacing forklifts can significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions that this province contributes. In fact, going back to this chart, electrification can have a significant impact in most of the pieces of the pie. It also has a couple of additional benefits. Increasing demand for electricity will both help mitigate the cost of that electricity and over time will create new opportunities for renewable energy development, either at the macro level or at the facility level. The good news is that at present, there are quite a number of different financial supports like those that Gerald highlighted that are available to assist in the electrification of our economy or other pathways that can lead to decarbonization. So we're all here because we believe climate change is the challenge for our time. But let's remember that taking on this challenge is not easy, nor is it inexpensive for anyone. I'm sure there would be a pretty broad consensus in this room that increasing the adoption of electric cars is a logical approach to reducing our high transportation emissions. But how many of us have made the decision so far to purchase an electric car? We perceive it to be probably expensive. Business and industry face those same challenges. Moreover, the pathway to emissions reductions in Newfoundland and Labrador is far more complex than in other jurisdictions. In places where electricity is generated through non-renewable means, such as coal, the low-hanging fruit of energy efficiency and renewable energy are available to achieve their goals. In this province, where we aren't burning a whole lot of fossil fuel for that particular purpose, it's not quite as easy. So we need to be really creative, we need to be really diligent in our pursuit of a lower carbon economy. We have with us here two companies, Valet and Aqua Solutions, both NIA members, by the way, that have been and are doing some progressive things that should be celebrated that they will speak to momentarily. I think it's really important to recognize and celebrate this kind of progress. And there has been progress. Newfoundland and Labrador, for the first time in its history, now has put a price on carbon. Is it as aggressive as some of us might hope? Perhaps not, but it's a significant step in the right direction. And 98% of our electricity, will soon be generated from renewable sources. Yes, Muskrat Falls has been problematic, as we know, in a number of fronts, but that kind of energy mix is extraordinary and, quite frankly, is the envy of our neighbors. So let's acknowledge some of these successes. We collectively have a whole lot to do, and time is short. But these are good foundations from which we can pursue a lower carbon economy. So thanks again to the organizers for the opportunity to speak. NIA will certainly keep a close eye on the results stemming from this conference. Perhaps there are some business ideas that our members can pursue from your notes and your ideas. In the meantime, I would encourage everyone here to buy a smart thermostat, offset their carbon emissions by buying some credits, or erect a wind turbine in their own backyard. I know some people that can help. Check out the directory in the back. Lastly, I would be remiss, and Matt would be fairly mad with me, if I didn't mention our annual Green Economy Conference, New Leaf. As a sponsor of this week's activities, I don't feel so bad about this shameless plug, by the way. New Leaf is taking place this year, October 16th and 17th, and early themes that are emerging are some of those that we've talked about here today and yesterday: electrification, renewable energy, environmental characterization and monitoring, which, by the way, is emerging as a real technological world-class strength of Newfoundland and Labrador, and sustainability in our communities. This will be the 8th iteration of our event, and I can say for certain that discussion between stakeholders around clean growth topics is far more sophisticated today than it was when this conference started in 2012. So there's an enormous amount of work to be done, but we're not starting from scratch. I commend everyone for taking pride in this event and encourage you to drive the agenda in your personal and professional lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Kieran. We're going to ask Erin Cullen now to come up and speak to us about the mining sector. Erin?
Thanks, Keith. Good morning, everyone. So as Keith mentioned, I'm Erin Cullen. I'm representing Valet here today. Just showing a title slide of what we actually do in this province. So right there on the slide, you're seeing some nickel rounds that we produce in Long Harbour. I also brought a little demo here to give you an idea of what that looks like. So that's what we produce here in the province. I do have to give you a disclaimer about what I'm about to present, and not to scare anybody, but what I'm here to tell you is that please don't go out and make any investment decisions based on what I'm here to tell you today. I'm not an economist. I can't predict the future, so bear that in mind as we go through. So to kick off, I did want to just mention a little bit about Valet and Newfoundland and Labrador, so who we are, what we do. We operate 2 sites. We have the Voisey's Bay Mine and Concentrator site. That's in Northern Labrador, you can see there. It's a remote site. It's a fly-in, fly-out operation. There's air and sea access only. We're not connected to the provincial energy grid in Voisey's Bay. And for those following the news, we're currently developing 2 underground mines in Voisey's Bay. So we're currently an open pit operation that's transitioning to underground. We also operate an office in Happy Valley Goose Bay to support our operations in Labrador. And on the island, we have our processing plant in Long Harbour. So Long Harbour uses a state-of-the-art hydrometallurgical process to take the concentrate products coming from Labrador and process them into the nickel rounds, which I showed you. We also produce copper sheets and cobalt rounds. For the most simplest way to look at hydrometallurgy, when they constructed the plant in Long Harbour, there was an opportunity to construct a smelter refinery, a more traditional technology of pyrometallurgy. However, we opted to go with hydro. So pyro, so burning. So in order to separate metals, pyrometallurgy uses a lot of energy to heat to high temperatures to burn the metals out. Hydro is using water, so using water to actually make the metals soluble and separate streams. So it's a much less energy-intense process to use hydrometallurgy, and that's what we're doing here in the province. We are Vale, of course, as part of a global mining company, so of course we are headquartered in Brazil, and Vale Newfoundland Labrador is just part of the base metals business that we have. So why nickel? So what's driving the nickel markets today is the growing interest in renewable energy technologies like batteries and energy storage. Our Long Harbour nickel is going, some of it is going directly into producing batteries. I think everybody in the room has probably heard of lithium-ion batteries. I'd like to read a quote, which is one of my favorites. It comes from Elon Musk, who's the CEO of Tesla. And he says, "Our cells should be called nickel graphite because primarily the cathode is nickel and the anode side is graphite with silicon oxide. There's a little bit of lithium in there, but it's like the salt on the salad." So this figure here comes from the Nickel Institute, and the Nickel Institute is a consortium of nickel producers globally. And so it's just meant to highlight the uses of nickel in batteries. So lithium compounds are combined with other materials like nickel to create lithium-ion batteries. So there's 2 examples here of cathodes. So one shows an 80% nickel use on the cathode side with aluminum and cobalt mixed in. The other one is a 33% nickel that has manganese and cobalt. What are the advantages of using nickel for batteries and energy storage? Nickel has a very high energy density, so it takes up less space, makes a lighter battery, gives you a longer life, and allows for energy storage. So nickel is definitely part of the green future. Another area that our nickel gets used for from Long Harbour is in high nickel alloys. So sulfur dioxide, which is not a primary greenhouse gas, but we know it contributes negatively to air pollution, which is also recognized by the International Maritime Organization, who set sulfur 2020 objectives. So in order to reduce their sulfur emissions, large ships are using diesel exhaust scrubbers. And that equipment in that scrubber environment has to be very robust. So scrubbers are typically high chloride, high temperature, very acidic conditions. So you need very corrosion-resistant alloys in order to operate there. And high nickel alloys provide the longest-lasting marine scrubbers. So that's another market that our nickel from Long Harbour directly goes into. When we talk about emissions in our province, you can see here, this is publicly available information that Gerald didn't show, but it is available to everyone on the government's website. So you can see Valet, there we have our 2 operations in Voisey's Bay and Long Harbour. We're the 4th highest emitter in the province. So I'll talk a little bit about where our emissions are actually coming from. I just want to make a mention here again that Voisey's Bay is a remote mine site. So we power our site with stationary diesel combustion engines. In Long Harbour, we are grid connected, so we do have electricity flowing from the grid, but we also have large boilers to run our large autoclaves. We do have some fuel consumption there. And so our emissions are about 88,000, this is 2017 data from Voisey's Bay, and about 40,000 from Long Harbour. So just a little bit about what that mix looks like. So I mentioned, looking at the Voisey's Bay side, the largest portion of the emissions comes from stationary combustion, so that's directly related to the stationary diesel generators. So those are powering our site. Highest energy consumers at the mine site and the concentrator, the crushing and grinding circuits, so that's where you're actually taking ore, rock material, and crushing and pulverizing it to be able to process it. We've done a number of things with the diesel generators over the years to increase energy efficiency. One big project we did was to increase the output of each individual generator from 4.1 megawatts to 4.4. And what that allowed us to do is to, instead of running 4 generators at a lower efficiency, run only 3 generators at a higher efficiency. We also take all the waste heat from those generators to heat all the buildings on site and the shops. So there's a glycol loop that runs through the site, so all of that waste heat is sent then to heating, so there's no extra heating requirement. We've also taken out any remote furnaces at the site, so anywhere we had other oil burning furnaces, we've extended our glycol loop to ensure full coverage of those buildings. The other big portion in Voisey's Bay comes from mobile equipment, so you see 19.5% there. So that's all of our heavy mining equipment that we need to operate the mine. Certainly it is diesel run equipment, and we've done a number of things over the years to also improve efficiencies with our equipment, so things like reducing idling, so trying to take steps in our operations to reduce any kind of idle time that we have. We've also looked at road and ramp maintenance, so making sure that the smoother the road is, the more energy efficient vehicle you have. We have also done payload exercises where we're maximizing payload on every single trip. So when we fill up one of our huge 777 haul trucks, we want to make sure that it's completely full so that we're getting the maximum use out of it. And the small proportion of Voisey's that comes from blasting. So blasting, of course, is a mix of ammonium nitrate and diesel fuel that creates a carbon emission. On the Long Harbour side, again, a large proportion of that comes from stationary combustion. So that is our boilers that are firing to heat our autoclaves, which is the start of the leaching process in Long Harbour. So that's basically where the concentrate that comes from Voisey's heads into in the process. It separates out the metals from the rest of the material. We have 10% mobile equipment in Long Harbour. The reason there's less mobile in Long Harbour is that it's a processing plant site. There's not the heavy mining equipment, so the equipment there would be things like snow clearing, road grading, that sort of stuff. And the 8% process comes from chemicals we're actually using in the process, like lime and soda ash, where we have an emission through the process. I put up a figure here just on the right-hand side of the slide. So our VNL operation, if you look at Vale, Newfoundland and Labrador, from the time that we mine ore in the pit in Voisey's Bay to the time that we're putting nickel out the door in Long Harbour, we're about 3.5 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of nickel that we produce. And taking a stat from the Nickel Institute, so again, the Nickel Institute covers global nickel operations. 7.9 kilograms of CO2 per ton of nickel is an industry average globally. So we are below the industry average, and I put that there just as a frame of reference. I don't put that there to say that we don't need to take action and that we're not committed to reducing our emissions further. I think we have a great opportunity in Newfoundland and Labrador that we can be a world-class nickel producer in terms of the emissions that we have. So talking about opportunities that we have in Voisey's Bay and Long Harbour, as we move to the underground mines in Voisey's Bay, we're installing what's called ventilation on demand. So as you go from an open pit to operation to underground, it's a significant increase in your energy demand that you require. And the big piece of energy in your underground mining is for ventilation. So ventilation ensures the safety of our employees who are working underground. So it's very important to have appropriate ventilation. Ventilation on demand can be best described as having a light switch on a sensor, on a motion sensor, so that at any given point in the underground mine, there might be headings where people aren't actively working. So we don't need ventilation in those areas. So ventilation will be off, but as people go into the areas, it comes on just like a motion sensor light. So we're working towards installing that. We've been able to reduce our haulage distances for waste rock. So an opportunity that we seized in the underground development is that the open pit, once mined out, will be able to store waste rock. So instead of hauling, right now we have a haul distance, a round trip about 17 kilometers. So increasing the emissions from our mobile fleet. We've now reduced that to about a kilometer, or will be reduced by 2022 when we're actually depositing into the open pit. And the third opportunity, which is a big one for us that we're actively working on in Voisey's Bay, is looking at wind energy. I'm showing the picture here is actually on the bottom of the screen is from one of our operations in Brazil. So Valet globally has other wind farms that we're operating. So it's not a new technology to Valet. And it's a great opportunity where we have an off-grid site in Voisey's Bay that we're able to create a microgrid solution. So we're actively engaged with the developer at this point, trying to look at what that wind project is going to look like and how we can get it started. On the Long Harbour side, we are still ramping up our plant. So our plant has a 50,000 ton nameplate capacity. And as we we've increased since 2014 when we first produced nickel, been increasing the output each year. We've seized a lot of opportunities where we see opportunities for efficiency that weren't initially identified. Currently, we're working on some of our heat exchangers that could save us about 500,000 liters a year in fuel, just by making some improvements to those that exist there now. The Long Harbour site also, in the original construction and design, had a limestone crushing plant. So we use a lime product in the process. The limestone crushing plant would have been to bring in limestone, crush it on site, and then use it in the process. And early on in the construction phase, we decided that that was not an appropriate solution. We took out the limestone crushing plant, and we're now purchasing a quicklime product directly from the market. That's the equivalent of removing about 30,000 tons of carbon dioxide a year from the provincial emissions profile. Third thing that we've done in Long Harbour, which is an indirect emission of ours, but employee busing to site. So we have 900 employees working in Long Harbour every day. And we had a lot of carpooling that was happening, but effectively we've removed 30 to 50 vehicles a day from traveling from the greater St. John's area out to the site and back. So it's a significant decrease in transportation emissions. It's been something that's definitely a good opportunity for our employees to take advantage of and been really well received. So there's a number of opportunities that we're looking at. I think there's going to be even more that we can recognize in the future. I think now that we have provincial programs where we can apply for funding, we've got support from groups like NIA who can look at what emerging technologies are out there. I think there's a lot of opportunities for us here in the province.
Thank you, Erin. We're going to ask Melissa now to come up and tell us a little bit about what Aker Solutions is doing locally. And following that, we'll start our Q&A session. What we'll do is we'll actually we'll try to cozy up a little bit more, form into bigger groups, and we'll give you a couple of minutes to kind of discuss what kind of questions you want to ask. Thanks. Might need your presentation.
It's important. Thank you, Keith. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for taking your time to come out to come out here today to talk about some really important initiatives that we're trying to take here in Newfoundland. I think it's a very important conference, and really appreciate everybody generating ideas on how to improve our beautiful world that we live in. And I also love seeing all the great generations, the mix of generations here today. I think it's very important. My name is Melissa English-Barbour. I'm Senior Health, Safety, Security, and Environment Manager for Aqua Solutions here in Canada. I'll be honest, it's only been the past couple of years I've really thought about climate change. Up until that point, I did what I thought was the right thing to do for the environment. When it came to keeping our environment clean, I didn't litter, recycled as best as I could, turned off electronics and lights when they weren't in use. But recently there's been so much communication regarding the impacts of greenhouse gas emissions and the actions needed to be taken immediately to slow down those impacts that I find it's always on my mind. Just going to grab lunch now makes me think about how much waste is in the packaging and what the reaction I'll get from my server if I brought reusable containers. I always have a reusable bag in my purse because I don't want to see a plastic bag or use a plastic bag that'll end up as a flag on a tree, a branch. And I just questioned last night why the vitamins that I bought were in a box when it was already in a container. And I'm always trying to find new ways to use items that we currently have instead of buying new. And I've come to realize that these are the thoughts, they're the kind of thoughts that are exactly needed for us. We need a mindset change. And I'm going to talk to you about what we've done in our office here in St. John's to take a positive step towards climate change. First, I'll start telling you a little bit about me. So I have a Bachelor of Business Administration from MUN, and I'm a Canadian Registered Safety Professional. And I've been working in HSSE in multiple industries for 18 years. And I'm also currently a member and a director on the Newfoundland Environment Industries Board, Association Board. But most importantly, I'm a wife and I'm a mother to 2 children, a 12-year-old daughter and a 14-year-old son. I like to spend time outdoors, on the water and in the woods, have embraced gardening, growing my own food, thrive on feeding my family responsibly and organically as best I can, and of course, I'm trying to raise my children to be good people. And although I don't consider myself an activist, I do think I'm a good citizen of society and would like to help influence others to be the same. I know I don't want my grandchildren to look at me when I'm older and asking me why I didn't do anything about climate change. It's everyone's responsibility to take charge of this climate crisis we're in and to do their part to combat climate change. So who's Aker Solutions? We're an ISO 9001, 14001, and 18001 registered company who engineers products, systems, and services required to unlock energy. Our goal is to maximize recovery and efficiency of oil and gas assets while using our expertise to develop the sustainable solutions of the future. Aqua Solutions is both responding to the shifts in the energy industry through our vision of being a leader in forging a sustainable future for our industry and the world it serves, as a way to help our customers and the world succeed in the ongoing energy transformation. Our view of sustainability is focused on 4 areas: economic and customer, HSSE, so zero HSE incidents, improve our industry safety through our offerings, and reduce environmental footprint of our operations. Social and energy, make investments in new technology and offerings to address more efficient oil and gas and alternative sources of energy. The main focus of my presentation today is on the HSSE portion of this slide and how we as a company locally have made changes to help reduce our environmental footprint of our onshore operations. Where to begin? Understanding what your carbon footprint can be a daunting task. What do you include? What do you not include? What do you directly influence? Do you include things outside your control? What about contractors and suppliers? What about work that you do on client sites? How far do you go? And here's some steps that we follow to help us. Our first step was identifying what our goal was and make a commitment to it. So we decided that the goal was to make our onshore operations in St. John's become carbon neutral through reduction measures and carbon offset purchases. When we first heard that Sharp Management had local carbon offsets ready for sale from a pair of wastewater treatment facilities in Appleton, Glenwood, and Stephenville, we wanted in. As a commitment to our goal of becoming carbon neutral, we purchased one of the very first carbon offsets available in Newfoundland from Sharp Management. And I see you back there, Glenn. which now sits proudly on the wall in our reception area for all to see. We are also very proud to be the first company in our province's oil and gas sector to purchase carbon offsets from Sharp Management. Now that we've made our commitment and set our goal, how are we going to get there? When we first started looking into getting a better understanding of what our current carbon footprint is, of course, we went straight to Google. If you search greenhouse gas emission calculator tool in Google, 13 million results appear. Very overwhelming, to say the least. There were so many sources of information, but none that really gave us enough information on how we should quantify and analyze our sources of emissions and how to reduce them. We didn't want to just have a starting number and compare against that at the end of the year. We wanted to be able to understand what our specific measures and targets should be every month and measure them and compare them monthly. We also wanted to be a gradual process. Change takes time. We didn't want to implement a bunch of initiatives right away and then forget about it. We wanted to understand where our biggest emissions were, what our quick wins would be, and take the time to successfully change the mindset of our employees and our company to help us implement some of the more difficult initiatives. We had to think outside the box. We were just learning and needed someone to guide us through that process. After analyzing multiple options, we partnered with the St. John's Board of Trade and other local companies to engage Climate Smart out of Vancouver to help us implement their certification program, which includes 3 half-day training sessions on greenhouse gas emissions, how to calculate them and how to reduce them, access to a web-based carbon management software to calculate your carbon footprint and manage it, and an external expert review of your first year's data and methodology. Climate Smart helped us identify our Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions that are generated from our operations, and we were able to quantify every single item for 2018 as our baseline. So we had a baseline to work from. From there, we were able to develop a 3-year reduction plan. So as you can see from the slide here, the top one, electricity, and that was our biggest emission, and then the next one being transporting people. The internet, as well as the Climate Smart training, provide us with so many ideas of things we could do to decrease our greenhouse gas emissions. But we knew we had to start small and work our way up to the initiatives that would be a little harder to implement. We focused on our Scope 1 and Scope 2 quick wins and low-cost options for our first year, including installing light sensors in all offices and general areas where possible to keep lights off when they weren't in use, installing programmable thermostats to help keep heat levels maintained, increasing inter-office hand deliveries instead of using courier services, training and utilizing local companies to calibrate our specialty equipment instead of air freighting them to the US, setting print default settings to password printing to prevent items from being printed unnecessarily, reducing paper waste, ordering reusable mugs with covers for all office personnel to prevent use of disposable cups and tops, improving coffee quality to reduce the amount of individual coffees being purchased and reduce waste of disposable coffee cups and tops, recycling end-of-life computers and accessories or donating them, communicating to personnel regarding proper recycling, adding posters to our recycling areas and ensuring that items are recycled appropriately, and also adding different items to our recycling program. We are halfway through our first year, and we've already implemented the majority of our quick wins. But we know this isn't the end. We had to set stretch targets to keep us motivated and help us with our overall mindset change. One of our stretch targets includes reducing air travel where possible. And I'm sure everybody can appreciate that that's a very difficult task for some of the work that we do. Aqua Solutions globally has developed multiple innovations with respect to decarbonization that we would like to help implement here in Canada. Examples like a recently awarded carbon capture contract with Twents in the Netherlands. Once the CO2 is captured and liquefied, it will be supplied by road tankers to users such as nearby greenhouses, where it will increase the yields of plants and vegetables and will contribute to the Netherlands' goals set by the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015. Aker Solutions has also invested in floating wind power technology company Principal Power, forming an alliance which brings our established expertise into the fast-growing renewable energy market. Offshore installed capacity for wind power is expected to more than double by 2022 from 2016 levels amid a global push to use fuels with lower carbon emissions following the 2015 Paris Agreement. We hope to be able to provide some of these types of innovations locally. Lastly, you have to celebrate your successes and reap the benefits of your hard work. In 2018, through becoming Climate Smart certified, we calculated our greenhouse gas emissions and identified that 94.05 tons of CO2 were generated by our operations in Canada. By implementing just one of our initiatives, we were able to use the cost savings to pay for all of our initiatives for 2019. Who knew we were spending approximately $12,000 a year on single-use kitchenware, such as cutlery, coffee cups, lids, and paper plates? By removing this one item, we were able to pay for such initiatives as that I mentioned earlier, light sensors, programmable thermostats, and other different training and equipment, and our mugs. We should see the cost savings year on year to help fund more energy-saving initiatives. As you can probably also see from the table shown, we were able to use these funds to purchase 95 more carbon offsets from Sharp Management to make our 2018 year carbon neutral, meeting our goal. We have also already purchased a portion of the carbon offsets that we think we may need for this year to help us carbon neutral for 2019. We're expecting our greenhouse gas emissions to be lower this year due to the initiatives that we have implemented. Not only were we able to save money, but these initiatives will reduce our energy consumption, our greenhouse gas emissions, and landfill use, and help influence others to do more to help combat climate change and reduce their carbon footprint. We are just one company. If every company made the effort to identify and reduce their Scope 1, Scope 2 initiatives or emissions as a start, it would make a huge step forward in helping to reduce our current climate state. Last but not least, in order to help influence others to start their journey towards carbon reduction and neutrality, we have shared our successes in local and national news. The left photo is another snip from the Evening Telegram showing Glenn Sharp from Sharp Management, Marsha, our HSSE advisor, Dave, our VP and General Manager, and a very big supporter of our environmental initiatives, and Matt from NIA. I was also approached by BNN Bloomberg for an interview, which is on the right and is available online. I hope that sharing our story and successes has encouraged other companies to take a step towards reducing their carbon footprint. In closing, I would like to use terminology from one of my favorite books called Influencer. We need to make the undesirable desirable by showing people the benefits of taking steps to positively impact climate change. And like the students striking from school on Fridays, we need to harness peer pressure, find strength in numbers to amplify our influence to make change. Thank you for your time and for your efforts.
Okay, thank you. Thanks to all the expert panel. Extremely interesting. We've seen some interesting ideas from large to small. We're going to take about 10 to 15 minutes now for some Q&A, but before we do that, if everyone can gather, cluster up in tables with markers and paper, and maybe try to just form some bigger groups. We're just going to take a couple of minutes now to do that, and then you can introduce yourselves at your tables and maybe talk a little bit about what kind of questions you want to ask. So we'll take 2 or 3 minutes for that.
Research shows that even reducing the number of waste baskets, like the red GML significantly because you actually the act of standing up and having to move it very much makes you think about what you're doing as opposed to it's right next to your house.
Okay, everyone, we're just going to take another minute. So if you want to peer review your questions, we'll take one more minute for that. Okay, everyone, we're going to start taking some questions now in the interest of keeping us on schedule. Nick, if I can get you to act as my lovely assistant. Okay, yeah, you can raise your hand. Nick is going to make his rounds now with the microphone and a coffee.
This is for the representative from the provincial government. So the greenhouse gas emissions calculations for the province, do they include the greenhouse gas emissions that are produced by the burning of the fossil fuels that we produce in this province?
Yes. In simple terms, any fuel that's combusted in the province is counted in the inventory for the province.
So any of our oil exports that are not combusted here
That's
are
correct.
not included.
No, it's just what's combusted in the province.
Even though we're producing, they will produce greenhouse gases eventually that will go back and influence climate change and have impacts on the province.
So the way the numbers work, it's where fuel is combusted. So if we take our exports and we export it to New York, then the New York emissions profile will include those emissions when it's combusted there.
Maybe I might drop the coffee. Slows you down a little bit.
Hi there. I have a question for Valet, but also for Aker, I guess. And I was discussing this with your colleague a little bit. I was just wondering if, as a result of your efforts to reduce emissions, if your company achieved any overall net cost reductions in their operations. I know that a lot of these initiatives require a lot of upfront investment, but over the long run, would you say that this would allow your company to operate at a lower cost?
Yeah, so I'll start. Yeah, so absolutely. I think a lot of these initiatives we call environmental initiatives are actually cost initiatives too. So we do have cases where we have actually reduced fuel consumption. So any reduction in fuel consumption is a direct cost savings to us for sure. Yeah.
And us as well. So for our office, which is what our office operations, our onshore operations of, is what I was talking about, we do have a cost savings that right now, for one of the things that we stopped doing, gave us the money to put all of our new initiatives in place for this year. The next initiatives that we're going to put in place will be less costly. They're just going to be more mind change type initiatives, but then we'll still see those cost savings going forward.
Hi, Sarah Bassler here. I have a question, I think it's for Gerald. You were talking about the fund, the provincial credit fund, and I was wondering whether, or just if you could speak to why Newfoundland isn't part of a bigger registry, I guess?
Yeah, it's a good question. When carbon pricing was being formulated nationally, we looked at how the federal government itself was to regulate large. And the approach was essentially to say, okay, if there's 100 competing companies in a sector, we'll look at the emissions for everyone. So in the case of mining, they would look at every mine in the country and say, who are the best performers, who are the worst performers. If you are a worst performer, you have to become a leading performer. If you're a leading performer, you don't have to do anything. The challenge we ran into is that we have a lot of unique facilities here. There are no other offshore production platforms. There's only, as I mentioned earlier, there's only one pelletizer. The hydromet is brand new, and there's only one of them in the country. The refinery is simply because it doesn't have access to natural gas. It's the only one in North America like that. So when we started looking at the numbers and working with the federal government on it, it turned out that the cost to these companies on that spectrum that the federal government was using would be really high relative to what it would have been had they achieved the same outcomes by looking at their history. We're doing the same thing and are doing the same thing, for example, with some of their facilities. Other provinces are doing the same thing. The challenge was the federal government was really rigid. They were saying, if you were going to play in with our regulations, you have to play by our rules. We said, okay, we have some unique facilities here. We need to establish rules that gives us the same outcomes, but recognizes some of these characteristics.
Does that mean that when Valet gets credits for reducing emissions, those credits can only be purchased by the other emitters in Newfoundland?
Yeah, that's correct. It's an in-province only.
Just Sarah, just to add to Gerald's point actually in that, when we were looking at the federal plan, so one of the things they wanted to compare in the federal plan was Long Harbour is a hydrometallurgical plant. There's another hydrometallurgical copper plant in Quebec, and they were trying to sort of compare us as apples to apples, so per ton of production. The challenge is that hydrometallurgical facility takes a product that's already 90% copper and turns it into 99.99% copper. So their emissions profile is very small because really the work that they're doing is small. Long Harbor takes a 20% nickel product and turns it into 99.99% nickel. So it's hard to compare, and it became very obvious when you're trying to look across the country, even with nickel mining. So there are other nickel mines, but it's hard to compare open pit, underground, especially Voisey's Bay, where we don't have access to a provincial energy network. We were being looked at under the federal plan as a energy producer. So we were getting lumped in with the likes of the Nalcors of the world, but we're not selling a product, we're producing energy for our own use. So it was very difficult to fit us into the federal plan. But I think I would like to acknowledge Gerald and his group for sure for the consultation that they did with Valet and other industry partners to really understand our emissions and what our concerns were. So acknowledgement to their group for doing that.
Hi. So, mostly for Gerald, I suppose, but others feel free to jump in. 4/5 of the world's known fossil fuel reserves have to stay in the ground for a climate-safe future, whereas here in Newfoundland Labrador, I guess the supposed plan is drilling 100 new exploration wells and doubling our offshore production, offshore oil and gas production, which is completely incompatible with 2030 targets. So how do you balance or justify this intended expansion with the, necessity to survive on this planet?
Sure, thank you for that. First off, that's a broad policy question that gets into energy policy. The Premier largely spoke to that recently at an offshore conference here in St. John's. Essentially, the thrust of what the Premier said at the time, and I'm going to refer to him, whereas it's a broader question that I can answer, is that demand for oil and gas will continue into the future. As long as there's a demand there, then it makes sense to get those reserves or get that oil and gas from the most efficient places you can find it. If the demand goes down, demand goes down. But as long as that demand is there, you should get it from where it's most efficient. Offshore, the world over, tends to be most efficient. Does that mean that over the long term we will be on oil and gas? Not sure. I can't speak to that. But where the Premier's headspace is right now, and where the province's policy is that we are promoting the offshore as it is one of the most efficient ways of meeting that global demand going forward.
But why should that demand overrule our, planet's future?
These are broad policy level questions that I'm not well placed to answer. My role here is really to talk about what we're doing in the way of carbon pricing. When it gets into relative energy policies and what we should be doing, that's more a question that you should place to the Premier or Minister Cody or others.
Yeah, it's a valid question. It's one we should definitely address in the citizens round table for sure. Just in the interest of time, I want to make sure we acknowledge the people who are watching remotely. So there are a couple of Twitter questions that have come in. So I think we should probably sneak one in. Hey, Nick?
Yes, certainly. I'm not a mining person, so please forgive me if I have difficulty even reading this question, but I'm going to try my best. And I think this is directed towards our mining friends. Protected areas are tools in decarbonization through carbon sequestration. Yet Newfoundland and Labrador is behind in their targets, I assume, in protected areas. Mining claims within zones are one roadblock to establishing more protected areas. How can industry contribute to ensuring that adequate areas within ecoregions are set aside? Is that clear? I tried my best.
I think so. That's, again, a very broad question. So Vale, Newfoundland, Labrador, we don't have any mining claims inside any kind of protected eco areas at this time. I think as an industry, certainly we have to work towards balancing those areas with the rights of mining companies that have claims in those areas. I don't know that I'm capable of providing an answer, but yeah, it's not something that I've personally come up against in my career with Valet.
We have time for one more. Cool. We got a Twitter question finally.
Thank you. So this is for the Valet. You know, we know that mining is very destructive to the environment, and there are concerns that as we go towards more renewable energy sources, we're going to need more mining to get those materials. Is it possible to, say, reuse old batteries or appliances instead of extracting raw materials? Or, you know, what is that kind of carbon comparison?
That's a great question. So absolutely, nickel is 100% recyclable. So nickel is part of a circular economy, and it has been for years. So it's there's lots of markets for metal recycling. I can't speak to the specific emissions profiles of taking examples of like used batteries or refrigerators or different things and recycling materials. I don't know what the emissions are compared to mining new, but I think absolutely we need to leverage as much metal recycling as possible.
Can I just speak to that one? So when we do recycle metals and hazardous materials here, there are companies in Newfoundland and Labrador that actually extract those materials and then ship them to markets where they can be refined and turned into other things. So that is something that is happening.
Who would have thought that this panel would encourage so much excellent conversation?
Yeah, it's a good thing. I think we have time for probably one more question. I think we have one right in the center of the room here. Nick, thank you.
Hi, Glenn Sharp. Gerald, my question's for you. You indicated that the offsets, which I believe we're the only company right now in Newfoundland providing carbon offsets, that the program to bring that into a registry or into a way that companies can buy that is coming, but I believe it's 2-3 years out. And right now, the government's got the green fund that companies that have issues meeting their targets can pay the government, and the government tries to do green projects. But the offsets are a direct indication of green projects. And you know, as there's only me here with carbon offsets, how can we not get involved now? We're sitting on the sidelines, we're doing the right thing, we've got the credits ready, but we can't get into your program.
Yeah, the two things on that. Well, first off, I believe you are the only company. I'm not aware of another company right at the moment. One of the challenges we face is that everything we do has to be passed or approved by the federal government as being comparable to its regulations. And recent court cases in Saskatchewan, Alberta have demonstrated that. The federal government hasn't yet established a federal offset program. They're doing that now, and there's a public consultation ongoing, and I invite everyone here to participate in that, and I can provide the link to the federal documents. We're going to be moving at around the same time. That's the intent, the policy intent, to move forward. The industry fund that we're talking about does not have any money into it right now. That industry-funded fund, the Valets and offshore companies of the world will have the option to pay into that. The first money's fall of 2020. At that point, we'll start to look look at how to spend that money. We're anticipating establishing an advisory panel, an expert advisory panel that will advise the minister how to do that. Eligibility will be open to everyone out there in the manufacturing industrial sector, not just those that are regulated. But to answer your question directly, you know, we are moving that way, but we'll have to take baby steps to get there. We put a lot of horsepower into getting this system up and running, and there are pieces now that we're filling in the blanks. I would hope that, you know, I can't speak for government, but hope that we'll see some movement in the next couple of years.
Okay, I'm told that we've got to stay prompt on time because the field trip is going to happen promptly at the buses arriving right on time. So we're going to move to the next part, which is the Citizens Assembly. I suspect we're going to get some good discussion here. In the interest of time, what we're going to do is we're going to take 25 minutes, discuss basically what we should do for decarbonizing the sector, and how this can be achieved. So we're basically what we're going to do is discuss all three at your tables at the same time. You nominate a person for taking the notes, and we're going to take about 25 minutes to work through that as teams.